Hi, this is Scott Lancer, the Director of Associates for Biblical Research, and we welcome you to another episode of Digging for Truth. Today I have a very special guest via Skype joining me today, and it is Natasha Crain, and we're going to meet Natasha and talk about her work in apologetics, especially her outreach to young parents, to parents of children, and reaching them with apologetics and critical subjects that they are dealing with, raising their children. We're going to talk all about that. But I'd like to introduce Natasha. Natasha is married and the mother of 3 children. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and has a marketing background with an MBA in Marketing and Statistics. She also has a certificate in Christian Apologetics from Biola University and is a member of the International Society of Women in Apologetics. She's a Christian parenting blogger at christianmomthoughts.com, and we'll be talking about her blogging work there and her website. She's written 2 books, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, 40 Conversations to Help Them Build a Lasting Faith. And her other book is Talking with Your Kids About God, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. Natasha, thank you for being with us today. So glad you could be here.
Thank you. Oh, I'm excited to be on with you. Nice to see you.
Absolutely. Now, Natasha, we're going to be moving very quickly here in some of these subjects we're going to be talking about, and we're focusing on the issues around the lives of kids growing up in a generation where there's rampant atheism, and there's a lot of attacks and things coming against them. A lot of our kids, our Christian kids, are intimidated by what's going on, and the parents are as well. So we want to discuss that a little bit. We've all been reading articles, and those of us who are really focused on apologetics, we're watching this sad movement of Christian students falling away from their faith, dropping out of the church, and becoming disengaged. And it's something we're all very, very much, we're very concerned about, obviously. Natasha, could you explain for our audience how you got involved in this issue and how you were brought into this whole realm of apologetics and dealing with some of this rampant atheism?
Sure. Well, I started a blog 7 years ago called Christian Mom Thoughts, as you said. And when I started it, really, I just wanted to do it because I had 3 kids who are ages 3 and under. And honestly, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed and isolated at the time. It was hard to kind of find fellowship with other moms in that same season of life. So I thought, you know what, I can start a blog and I'll meet some other parents online and kind of have that virtual community, even if I couldn't have one more locally at the time. And so I started writing posts, just simple things about Christian parenting, how we were raising our kids to know and love Jesus, even though they were very little. I was writing about things like devotionals and songs that we could sing and memorizing scripture, things like that. And it was great. It turned out exactly like how I was hoping that it would. I was meeting a lot of parents and having some great discussions. But something really unexpected happened along the way, in that as my readership grew and people were sharing my blog posts, it started bringing a lot of skeptics to my site.
Yes.
And they were challenging me on everything that you can imagine, that in ways that I had never heard before. I had grown up in a Christian home. I had spent hundreds of hours in church. I had never turned away from my faith, but I had no idea how to answer the kinds of objections that I was hearing. I was getting things every single day about how there's no evidence for God's existence, and the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. There's no evidence even that Jesus existed as a person in history, and science has disproved God, just everything. And I realized at that point that my kids were growing up in a very, very different world
Yes.
than the one in which I grew up. And
Yeah.
so I discovered apologetics, how we make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. And it just became my passion after that, because I saw how desperately our kids need to understand this.
That's right.
And as I studied it and I got into it, then I really started turning my blog into a place where I was then equipping other Christian parents with that understanding of the challenges and how we can
Yeah.
best talk to our kids about them.
Yeah, and in our world today, what has been called the new atheism, I think the new atheism is becoming a little older, and there's further developments along with all of that. But the new atheism really has a severe impact on our kids. Maybe we could just briefly talk about that.
Yeah, well, just to make sure everyone understands the term we're using, new atheism is a term that was coined about a decade ago. And
Yeah.
it came into use because what we started to see was that atheists were no longer just sort of having this passive, yeah, I don't really believe in God, and that's okay, you believe in God and everyone's fine. It suddenly became this very vocal thing where it was anti theistic. So instead of just saying, well, I don't believe in God, it's, I don't believe in God. There's no evidence for the existence of God, and no one else should believe in God either because religion is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so it was this very kind of hostile approach to religion in general. And
Hmm.
sometimes people think, well, atheists are still a minority in the country. We don't really have to worry about this. But I always tell parents, you have to remember that if you have 100 people in a room and 95 of them are pretty quiet and five are making a lot of noise, who do you pay attention to? You
Right.
hear the people who are really being vocal. And
Hmm.
that's what we've seen in the last few years, especially, is that as these voices have risen in our culture, we see that the statistics bear out that kids are listening and that they're turning away from their faith. And like you said, we've all heard those statistics, but
Yes.
they have been shown over and over that at least 60% of kids today are walking away from their faith by their early 20s. And
Yeah.
it's not a question of whether this is happening, it's is the number more like 60% or 90%. And in large part, this is in response to the intellectual kinds of challenges that
Hmm.
people like the new atheists have brought to light. And it's
That's
not
right.
obviously only because of this group, but in large part, we can see that the claims themselves are the same reasons that kids are citing for walking away from their faith.
That's right, and it's important to understand this battle. Like you said, the new atheism is about 10 years old now, so there are some new developments. That's for another show. I want us to talk today. We only have about a minute here in this segment, but just introduce the idea of the learning the what of our faith versus the why of our faith. Maybe you could just open that up. Just we only have about a minute.
Yeah, I think it's really natural for parents to explain what we believe as Christians, but a lot of times we don't think that we need to explain, well, how do we know this is actually true? And in a
Mm-hmm.
world where our kids are constantly encountering other ideas like those of the new atheists that we just talked about, it becomes
Yes.
absolutely critical that they understand how to engage with those ideas and
Mm-hmm.
why there's good reason to hang on to the faith and all the whats that we have taught them.
Yeah, yeah. The kids need to know more than just simply that there's a Bible story or there's just, they know the Bible stories, but they don't know the background of the Bible. And we'll talk some more about that because I think that's a critical issue. Well, this is great to have this conversation with Natasha today. We are so glad you've joined us. And when we come back, we'll continue this important discussion as we're challenged to prepare our kids to confront the ideas, the attacks that are coming against them in the public square. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, this is Scott Lancer. We welcome you back to Digging for Truth and with my interview with my special guest, Natasha Crain. And Natasha is an apologist and she is an expert in dealing with issues affecting parents and children. And we're talking with her today about some of those things. And we introduced at the end of the last segment, we were talking about the importance of the issues of what and why. We, at ABR, we are dealing every day with issues connected with archaeology and with all the issues connected with evidence for faith. And so for us as a ministry, we are fully engaged in explaining the whys on many subjects to do with the biblical history. So when people read about Jericho or some city or place or event in the Bible, we're giving all that background. So we're used to explaining the whys, the backgrounds, and these explanations. But for a lot of kids, they are getting, they're going to Sunday school, getting Bible stories, and they're being taught these things, and they're all good, but they're not prepared for the assault of the new atheists on why they believe. So, Natasha, I want to expand on that a little bit further. I want to give you a little bit more time to talk about that, because I think that is one of the critical things for those who are not being taught where the Bible came from, why we believe it's true, what the evidence for biblical authority, where's that authority come from? All those issues are critically important. Maybe you could expand on that just a little bit more.
Yeah, it's funny because I decided I was going to write a blog post one day where I calculated how many hours I had spent in church, I think, as a kid. And so I figured out that if you go to church about 90% of the time, so we allow for some sick times and things like that, from the time you're in kindergarten through senior in high school, that's like over 600 hours in church. And I can tell you that after 600 hours in church, there was not one conversation had about why there was good reason to believe the Bible was true. And I've spoken at many events, at many conferences, and I asked people to raise their hands and tell me how many of them had learned why there's good reason to believe it's true. And you never see the hands go up.
Yeah.
This is something that we just take for granted. I could have told you all about Joseph and his multicolored coat and Daniel in the lion's den, and I loved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was my favorite.
Yeah.
But all of those, if we don't really grasp that they're true, become stories. They become nothing more than stories. And so when somebody comes along and says, "You believe this stuff? You believe that there was a guy swallowed by a big fish?" I mean, you don't know what to say, and you feel the shame and the burden of it. So it's not just about teaching our kids what's in the Bible. It has to be what about the Bible.
Yes.
What do we look at to know that the Bible is actually true? And that's how we can know that the Bible should be our source of authority. It's a fundamental subject that kids should understand that just so often gets missed.
Yeah, that's right. And so in 1 Peter 3:15, when we're told to give a defense for our faith, kids are unprepared for that, because they say, well, yeah, I believe about Joseph and the multicolored coat, but they don't have the tools to defend his historicity. And so that's so very, very important. 1 Peter 3:15 is essential to encourage us to defend our faith, but we've got to give our kids something solid to defend their faith with. And I would just say to our audience, of course, ABR's work is, we deal with Joseph, and we deal with the background, those historical backgrounds. It's critically important in our work. Well, Natasha, what are the particular challenges confronting our kids today? How are these challenges different than what may have confronted kids from previous generations?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think there's a disconnect a bit between what parents assume are the biggest challenges and what the fundamental challenges really are. So when I talk to parents, if I ask them what are the biggest challenges that you think are facing your kids, I think 95 out of 100 will say something about homosexuality, same-sex marriage, transgenderism. So they're talking about these cultural topics that are really at the forefront. But what parents don't realize is that those topics are just the tip of worldview iceberg.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to talk to your kids about what the Bible says about homosexuality, but yet you haven't taught them why there's good reason to believe the Bible is actually true, you're not going to make any kind of headway on this topic.
That's
And
right.
so a lot of times I'll ask them and say, well, what do your kids believe about the Bible right now, before I will answer the rest of that question. And they'll say, well, honestly, I'm not sure. And so the fundamental questions that underlie all these cultural issues, these are the biggest challenges today, whether or not they kind of hit us on the head all the time. So what evidence is there for God's existence? What evidence is there for the resurrection of Jesus that would show us Christianity is actually true? And what evidence is there for the reliability of the Bible? These are the core questions that drive so much else today, whether we realize it or not.
Yes, absolutely. What you're saying is so critically important. How do you reach out, Natasha, in your ministry to young moms, to young parents, and make this practical, real to them?
Well, I think it's important to understand that we approach everything else in our kids' life in a way that we look at what they need to know and then we prepare them accordingly and very specifically. So, if it's academics and we know they need to learn about World War II at this point in their life, they need to learn about algebra at this point, we prepare them for that. But for some reason, with our kids' spiritual development, we don't think of it that way sometimes. But it's really the same thing. We need to understand the landscape of the challenges that are out there so that we
Yes.
can prepare them accordingly, just like we would if we're talking about academics or a health issue, anything else. It's really the same thing.
Yes, yes. Well, Natasha, in our last minute here, I'd like you to just maybe help the parents who are watching who are just exhausted. They're busy. I talk to parents all the time about the fact like I don't have time to read. I don't have time to deal with all of this, and they're worried about their kids. How would you encourage them?
I would say that it's easy to get overwhelmed, but we can still take one small step forward. And so
Hmm.
instead of giving into that feeling of overwhelm that we do so often have as parents, and I get it, I feel overwhelmed all the time. I felt overwhelmed this morning just getting my kids to school. So I
Yes.
get it, but we need to understand and recognize this is important. This is about our kids' spiritual lives and it has eternal implications. So there can be nothing more important. So we might feel overwhelmed, but we just have to take one step forward. It's about getting equipped ourselves and taking that step and saying, okay, I'm going to read one thing today. I'm going to read one article on this topic, or I'm going to get one book and I'm going to start reading maybe 3 pages a day, whatever it is for you. But it's making a choice. It's got to be a conscious decision.
That's right. And of course, if our viewers would go to your website, uh, it's christianmomthoughts.com. Your blogs are very encouraging, and they give great content to encourage parents in this great battle that we have before us. Well, we are wrapping up our second segment here at this point, but we encourage you to come back and join us for the third segment as we continue our conversation with Natasha Crain.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth and to our interview today with Natasha Crain. Natasha, we've been talking about this important world of reaching out to our kids and to reaching out to parents and explaining the importance of apologetics as part of parenting. And so, Natasha, I want to talk a little bit about your books. You've written 2 books. I thought maybe you could just introduce our viewers to those books and explain what you're addressing there.
Sure. Well, I wrote a blog post about, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago now, and it was called 65 Apologetics Questions That Every Parent Should Learn to Answer. And it was really interesting because it went viral. It was shared thousands and thousands of times. And I thought this was fascinating because it was literally a list of questions. And there were no links to answers, there were no answers given, but it was the questions. And that was really the start of my book writing process because I realized that so many parents, even though they know the world is challenging today, they don't really know how to crystallize the specific questions we're talking
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
And so the design of my books is really to present parents with those questions and say, this is what we most need to be concerned with. And then to just give some straightforward, introductory level, easy to understand answers in 4 to 5 pages for that busy parent, like we were talking about before. So my first book is called Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, and that one is sort of an Apologetics 101. And that book takes you through 40 of the biggest challenges today across the topics of God and Jesus, truth and worldviews, the Bible, and science. And now I'm working on a series of books that take you deeper into those topics. So my second book is Talking with Your Kids About God. And this one goes deeper into 30 conversations specifically about God. So looking at the evidence for God's existence and all these big questions about how science and God relate and believing in God. So the one I'm writing now is Talking to Your Kids About Jesus, which will then naturally go into 30 conversations specifically about Jesus. But they're all kind of the same style, where it's a parent-to-parent voice just walking you through, these are the key things that we need to understand today.
Amen. Well, when I saw, the first time I saw one of your blogs, I said to myself, we've got to have Natasha on our TV show because I want to make sure that the parents who are watching avail themselves of the work that you've done. I think it's one of the most critical things. We need a paradigm shift in Christianity and evangelical Christianity here in America. We need a paradigm shift to understanding that training is the full responsibility ultimately of parents. It starts there. And so that paradigm shift has to be towards giving them the training and the tools that they need to confront this new world. And the kids they're in the middle of the battleground, and they're being knocked over by arguments that they're ill prepared to deal with. And so I really want to encourage parents. It seems like it's overwhelming, a daunting task, but the materials that you have written, your books and your blog, are a tremendous way to get started into this new way of thinking. I'm sure you would agree with me on that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I like what you say about, it's a paradigm shift. It's a different way of thinking about these things.
Yes, yes.
And a lot of times parents want to know, well, when should I start teaching my kids apologetics? What age should this happen at? And I think that's kind of a misunderstanding about how this whole thing works together. We should be teaching apologetics from the day we're teaching our kids about Jesus. So if you're talking about Jesus at age 3, then you can begin talking about why we have good reason to believe that this is true. Now, of course, that means that as a parent, you have to be equipped first. When you begin to read and you begin to understand these things and can make the case for the truth of Christianity yourself, you see opportunities everywhere to talk to your kids. And some people say, well, how could you possibly do that with a 3 or 4-year-old? I'll give you one little example. Kids at that age are always asking, but how do I know God is there if I can't see him? So what a great opportunity to start building their worldview and saying, you know what? I know we can't see God, and that seems a little bit hard to understand, but what I want you to know is that God has left us a lot of evidence so that we can be really confident we do know he's there. And even that, it's that paradigm shift. It's helping kids understand something about their worldview that there are many adults today that don't understand, that just say, well, it's just about faith. And by that, they mean a blind kind of faith. But from the time our kids are very little, we can teach them to think differently about that.
All right, very good. Now, Natasha, how would you encourage parents to use your books in this training process?
Well, I think it's tempting for parents to pick up my books, and because they are books with lots of questions, and then there are 40 questions in the first and 30 in the second, sometimes I think they're seen as reference books. Well, if my child asks this, then I can go to the book and answer the question. But the best way to use the books really is to read them from front to back, because they're designed to give you this broad understanding so that you can begin seeing these opportunities in your day-to-day life, so that you can have these conversations. I always like to tell parents, don't see yourself as a Q&A machine. We don't want to be in a position where we're just waiting for that question to come. We need to be proactive. We need to be the ones who are bringing the questions to our kids and saying, hey, how do you know you can trust the Bible's authors? Why do you believe what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said? And start to challenge them in those ways. And when we understand that material, then we can be the ones to bring it to them. So the best way to use the books is really to read them just like you would any other book, so that you have the knowledge you can then pass on with your kids. And my second book, this series that I'm working with, where it goes deeper, every single chapter actually has a conversation guide with it that walks you step by step through having the conversations about that chapter's content. So I think a lot of parents are finding that helpful.
Yeah, and I think if they go to your blog, there's other resources that you're recommending there as well. So this is beginning a process for some to greater education, greater training, and how to reach out to our kids. Natasha, we just have a minute left here. Are there other practical steps that you'd recommend for parents in this process of bringing apologetic training to their kids?
I think one of the most important things that you can do is just setting aside some time each week. Parents like to depend on teachable moments for things because it's kind of easier. If something happens to arise, then we can talk about it then. But the fact is that a teachable moment is not going to arise for every single thing you need to be talking about with your kids as it comes to faith. So setting aside time, start with 30 minutes a week. Everyone should be able to make 30 minutes a week where you come together as a family to talk about these big issues of faith and really just grow together spiritually. And that will make a world of difference in your home.
Yeah, just making sure you've planned in time to regularly talk about these things is the starting point, because there is lots of material out there that you can use to help train our kids. Yeah, well, I would encourage our viewers to go to christianmomthoughts.com, check out Natasha's blog, and pick up her books. This is an important topic that we want to focus on. Well, thank you today for joining us. Thank you, Natasha, for being with us. We pray God's blessings on all the parents out there who are training their children.